Hello and welcome to the Night Watch Show. I'm wearing sunglasses today to hold on to a degree of privacy, although I know it's not very effective. The topic for today has a lot to do with privacy rights and various freedoms that have been eroded throughout the time that we've all been experiencing restrictions and loss of freedom and quarantines during the time of the novel coronavirus. So that is the first phase of this discussion. Also, we will touch on Anonymous, also known as Legion, and the statement they made regarding releasing information on crimes committed by police officers in Minnesota in the context of the first-degree murder of Mr. George Floyd by inmate Chauvin. And we'll also touch on just some big picture thinking in terms of expanded criminality, loss of privacy rights, protests, and what does this all mean? So to begin with, I just want to touch on something that many of us are aware of. Recently, something was implemented in smartphones and various devices around the world, such as in iPhone iOS 13.5, the mandatory inclusion of contact tracing API in our smartphones, basically meaning that if you update your phone or buy a new phone that's been updated, it's included. Now, contact tracing is being presented to help combat the pandemic, which makes a lot of sense when used properly. It's also a very powerful technology to be used potentially by intelligence and law enforcement and even potentially politicians globally. Contact tracing, when used with an application, has the ability to keep track of where you've been, who you've been in contact with, and really assist in mapping it all out. Now, that's great when fighting a pandemic. The question is, will that API still be in your devices 10 years from now? Even if there is no pandemic, I believe it will be. And the simple explanation will be that way we're ready for the next pandemic. The problem is, although the intention is stated now, it is for the use of health authorities. The problem is, in many governments around the world, including America, there are federalized health authorities, many of whom report to cabinet level members, many of those that have direct or indirect influence over law enforcement and even military, and can even influence detention, quarantine, and arrest, etc. So health authorities are not always your local community health officials that are doing their best as kind of semi-hybrid frontliners even, or even frontliners directly. We're talking about authorities that could be working directly for the federal government. Now, there is no law that states contact tracing may only be used by health authorities. That's just the current intention. So bottom line, I won't spend too much time on this, but by allowing all devices to have this coding included now that allows contact tracing technology to be built into our devices, what this means is that through applications, perhaps that we already use, health applications or other applications, there would be various backdoor opportunities with warrant or potentially even without warrant to be able to access that information. Now, I'm not concerned about the rights of criminals around the world. I'm not a defense attorney, and that is not my focus. My focus is regular law-abiding citizens that have opinions that are reasonable and that have lost freedoms. And basically, the point of this is that if you're having lunch 3 tables away from someone with extreme views, and because of that, you have essentially been grouped into potentially people that have extreme views, and therefore you're subject to some type of surveillance on an ongoing basis where they're not only tracking you, but your friends and their friends and so on. I think it's a bit scary, especially in the context of what I'm about to tell you. And what I'm about to tell you is that a lot of you probably already know this. Over the last several months during the pandemic, many laws have either been passed, renewed or expanded in different parts of the world that have either eroded privacy or have actually expanded powers of law enforcement or have actually increased criminality in areas that it did not previously exist. So making criminals out of non-criminals. One example is expanding the definition of terrorism to include, in certain countries, in certain regions of the world, to include people that are critical of the government. For example, if you were to use a hashtag in certain countries, let's say you were to say, oust Senator blank, blank, blank. Well, ousting the senator, using it as a hashtag, you might simply be exercising your freedom of speech and freedom of opinion and freedom to share your objective ideas and thoughts with the world. However, you could be perceived by certain governments essentially as promoting the overthrow of a government or promoting the physical removal of a political figure, and thereby fall under the classification of potentially being a terrorist, which in this case you are not. However, based on broad and expansion of definitions of terrorism, you could fall into that category, which in many parts of the world would subject you to warrantless surveillance, warrantless arrest and detention, warrantless interrogation, and possibly even imprisonment with successful conviction. And based on broadened terms, you have to be careful what you say. I am 100% with all of my heart and soul against terrorism. As an honorably discharged member of the armed forces, as a veteran, I have fought against terrorism and I'm totally against it. But if I use a hashtag oust President so-and-so, that can be considered as a threat or a attempt to incite some type of civil unrest, which can fall under the general grouping of terrorism and thereby losing all rights. You add that to contact tracing. Now, suddenly you're on a watch list because you've used a hashtag or you've shared an opinion that you don't agree with the current administration. Now you're a threat to the administration. Because of that, you're assumed to be arguing for the overthrow of the government, which is a ridiculous stretch, but you fall under that category in this example, and therefore you fall under the general classification of terrorism, which subjects you to all types of monitoring and restrictions and even physical loss of freedom. Now, at the same time, contact tracing, who do you know? Who do they know? Who else is being watched and observed for also sharing anti-official or anti-policy or even anti-government hashtags or statements? And what if you're one of these individuals that hasn't used that hashtag, but one of your friends has, and you hang out with that friend, and so due to contact tracing, it's known that you associate with people that are using hashtags that are advocating for the removal of a politician from office. Now, in your mind, you're talking about impeachment or removing them through a legal process, but instead, it can be construed that it's assumed that you're advocating some type of an overthrow, which is ridiculous of a stretch. But that is where things now are at. Now you take what's going on with Anonymous, also known as the Legion, in their, I wouldn't call it a threat, but in their statement that they will release information on crimes committed by law enforcement in Minneapolis. And if you promote that, if you use hashtags to encourage that, if you use hashtags to promote that, essentially you may be committing a crime by inciting an illegal act. And if that illegal act is perceived to be one that will cause more protests and rioting, you might essentially be sharing a hashtag or an opinion that indirectly is leading to a crime committed by Anonymous, the Legion, and indirectly lead to an increase in protests and indirectly be inciting some type of government overthrow, and therefore you're a terrorist now, and therefore you lose all your rights, and et cetera, et cetera. Now, that is absolutely ridiculous, but that's where we find ourselves. So I cannot say that I think what Anonymous, also known as the Legion, is doing, because if I were to say that, it could potentially be a crime just to say that. However, what I can say at this stage, based on my rights as they exist today at least, it could change next week, what I can say is that I strongly believe that anyone in the world who has information on crimes committed by law enforcement officers, prosecutors, government officials, and even politicians in Minnesota regarding the abuse of their power, regarding crimes against the very people that they are sworn to protect, to serve, and to represent, that information should be released immediately and swiftly and promptly. I'm not concerned with the ways that they obtain that information. I'm not a prosecutor, I'm not an attorney. That's not my concern. My only concern is anyone that has information of such nature should certainly present that information, and they should do so at this time, because we do need to achieve justice. What has gone on by law enforcement in a long chain of unjustified killings and murders of people, whether racially motivated, which is a massive, huge problem we're facing, or whether it's simply an abuse of human rights targeting any race without regard to race, or whether it's racially motivated, as it appears in this case, it sure is racially motivated. I think that's quite apparent and quite obvious that we have racist police officers who are exerting their racist ideology through use of force and essentially killing people based on race. So it's undeniable that this is a racially motivated crime, which isn't that considered a hate crime? And where are the more serious charges against inmate Chauvin? And why was he granted $500,000 bail that he'll probably end up making bail and being out of jail for a year or two during the trial, which is just a travesty of justice? And why is it third-degree murder and not first, where it carries a penalty of up to $40,000 or up to 25 years, meaning either or? It could just be a monetary fine. It could be a year in jail and a $10,000 fine. Who knows? He may have dirt on judges, on prosecutors, on politicians, and they may owe him favors. And this sure seems like a favor to have a murder third degree rather than first degree with hate crimes and anything else that should be added to it. I'm not a lawyer, as mentioned earlier, but it just seems quite ridiculous and totally unfair. So long story short, when a group like Anonymous, aka the Legion, positions itself to expose information similar to what Julian Assange and WikiLeaks did in the past, if you encourage such a thing, maybe that makes you a terrorist, and maybe that makes you surveillance, and maybe that makes you lose privacy rights, and maybe that makes you get arrested and detained and interrogated, or at the very least, maybe you end up getting contact traced and all of your friends get contact traced and everybody ends up facing all kinds of unexpected consequences that are really unreasonable. So in any case, I'm not advocating or promoting or encouraging anything illegal. The only thing I am advocating and encouraging is anyone that has information on the crimes committed by these police officers, meaning all of them in the state of Minnesota and specifically Minneapolis, should disclose that information. And I don't care where it came from, it just needs to be disclosed. So when you look at the big picture here, an erosion of various freedoms. In the United States recently, there was a renewal of FISA legislation, of which some politicians didn't show up, one of them being Bernie Sanders, and there was a vote that was missed by one vote. 60 required, they had 59, which I believe would have had kind of a favorable outcome for rights, but of course that failed. So long story short, law enforcement in America can access your web search history without warrant, meaning a vast array of intelligence gathering on everybody. The problem is you have someone that goes onto a search engine and Googles something like protest Seattle, and So you're searching because you're just interested in seeing what's going on, but now you're going on a list somewhere that you're interested in protests in Seattle, and maybe you're a protester, and then maybe you're also using a hashtag somewhere that's against a president or against a senator or against the mayor or against whoever, and now you're suddenly this high-risk individual with opinions against the government that has to be closely watched, and then your friends end up getting lumped into the same category due to contact tracing. So this is big picture thinking. I'm not saying this is going to happen today, but when you add this all together, in the fallout of past tragedies that occurred in America, mass horrible tragedies that occurred in America, if I even mention what they are, this video will probably experience adverse consequences, so I won't. But there were just a plethora of laws passed to combat terrorism that have been misused in all kinds of ways, and it almost seems like a lot of these laws don't actually do anything to harm or to limit terrorists. What they end up doing is they end up being inflicted upon regular law-abiding citizens that are against terrorism. So we all end up losing our freedoms, and meanwhile terrorists continue to be terrorists, and the rest of us who are law-abiding citizens just sharing opinions end up with all type of restrictions and freedom of speech limitations. So we find ourselves now coming out of the pandemic in a new normal that unfortunately seems to include a lot of loss of privacy rights, a lot of loss of freedoms, an expanded definition of various forms of criminality, to the point where we have to be quite careful what we say, because saying the wrong thing can be taken out of context, especially if you're against a government official or an administration. You could be singled out, your life could be destroyed based on nothing, based on literally nothing other than sharing some opinions and freedom of speech and having no ill intentions whatsoever. So I feel that we're in dangerous times in terms of power plays, in terms of freedoms, and in terms of privacy. Now, if you're someone that trusts all governments around the world will always do the right thing at all times, then great. Some would say ignorance is bliss. It's great to have that feeling that, everybody's going to do the right thing and no one's going to abuse their power. But unfortunately, there have been so many cases where that's been proven through history to be untrue. So the problem is, when you have contact tracing API built into your devices, can that be exploited, and will that be exploited not only by various governments and intelligence agencies, but even also by hackers and others? Of course, it probably will be over time. Why wouldn't it be? Everything else has been. So just something to think about today. And I hope that those crimes by the officers in Minnesota are released soon. And that's all I should say, because I've got so many keywords that I've used in this video. The bots, the machine learning, and all of the algorithms are going to be screening this video, and they're probably going to be quite confused as they try to decipher what I mean. But my meaning is clear. I'm against terrorism in all forms. I am for human rights and rights of privacy. I am not defending the rights of criminals. I am defending the rights of law-abiding citizens and their freedom of speech. Thank you for joining this episode of The Night Watch.